Elias only wanted to fix the floorboards to raise the auction price. He was bankrupt. But when the crowbar struck, the sound wasn't rotting wood, but solid metal. A chest had been hidden there since 1984. Inside, he didn't find the gold he hoped for. He found the bloody proof of why his family had been sentenced to a lifetime of poverty. Elias Thorne stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the warped floorboards that had bothered him for months. The wood had buckled near the stone fireplace, creating a subtle depression that caught his eye every time he walked through. Now, 3 days before the bank would seize everything his family had owned for 4 generations, he figured he might as well fix it. Not because it would save the farm, nothing would save it now, but because leaving it broken felt like surrender. The hammer felt heavy in his calloused hands. 52 years of hard work, and this was what he had to show for it. A house that was falling apart, a mortgage 3 months overdue, and a reputation in Blackwood County as the Thorne who finally lost it all. His grandfather would be ashamed. His father, buried 5 years now, would have found a way to keep fighting. But Elias was tired, bone tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He wedged the crowbar under the first board and pulled. The wood groaned, nails shrieking as they released from joists that hadn't been disturbed since the house was built in 1889. Dust exploded into the air, catching the afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows. The smell of old cedar and something else, something metallic and wrong, filled his nostrils. The second board came up easier, then the third. By the fourth, Elias could see into the crawl space beneath. That's when he noticed something that made his heart skip. The dirt below wasn't uniform. There was a rectangular depression, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, where the soil had been disturbed and then carefully smoothed over. Someone had buried something under his living room floor. Elias knelt and shone his flashlight into the gap. The beam caught the corner of something wrapped in oiled canvas, the kind that hunters use to protect rifles from moisture. His hands trembled as he reached down, fingers closing around fabric that felt stiff with age and rot. Whatever was inside was heavy, 60, maybe 70 pounds. He pulled it up slowly, grunting with the effort. Rusty, his 12-year-old red-bone coonhound, lifted his graying muzzle from his paws and whined softly. The dog's ears were back, his whole body tense. "Easy, boy," Elias muttered, but his own pulse was hammering. The canvas was bound with wire that had rusted through in places. When Elias cut it away and peeled back the fabric, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a chest exactly. It was an old ammunition box from the Second World War, olive-drab paint flaking off to reveal bare metal underneath. Someone had welded hasps onto it and secured it with a padlock that had long since corroded into uselessness. Elias broke the lock with a single strike of his hammer. The sound echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags that had yellowed with time, were documents, dozens of them. Rolled maps, a leather-bound ledger, photographs in sealed envelopes. And sitting on top of everything else, impossible to miss, was a sheriff's deputy badge, the metal tarnished almost black but still bearing the number 247. Elias's hands went cold. He knew that badge number. His grandfather, Thomas Thorne, had worn it until the night he died in 1984. The official story was that Thomas had gotten drunk and wrapped his truck around a tree on Old Mill Road. The family had been devastated, but no one questioned it. Thomas had a reputation for drinking, after all. But here was his badge, buried under the living room floor, hidden away like contraband. Elias lifted out the ledger with shaking hands. The leather was cracked, but the pages inside were protected by the plastic. He opened it to the first entry, dated January 15th, 1984. The handwriting was tight and precise. Received $15,000 from H. Vance for disposal site usage. Drums, X40. Contents marked as industrial cleaning solvent. Actual contents unknown. Site coordinates. See survey map number 3. H. Vance. Harlan Vance. The current mayor of Blackwood County. The wealthiest man in 3 counties. The man who owned the bank that was about to foreclose on this property. Elias flipped through page after page of entries. Dates, amounts, drum counts. The payments went on for months. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The last entry was dated October 3rd, 1984. 2 days before Thomas Thorne's truck allegedly hit that tree. Below that final entry, in different handwriting, shakier, more desperate, were 5 words. "They're going to kill me." The coffee in Elias's mug had gone cold an hour ago. He sat at the kitchen table, the contents of the ammunition box spread before him like artifacts from a crime scene. which, he was beginning to realize, they were. The maps were the most damning. Hand-drawn surveys of the county, showing property lines that didn't match the current deed records. According to these maps, the Thorne property extended another 40 acres to the north, right up to what was now Vance's private hunting reserve. That land included a steep ravine and a dried-up well that the county had condemned in the 70s. According to the ledger, that well wasn't dry. It was full of chemical drums. Elias pulled out his phone and tried to search for information about industrial dumping in the 80s, but the signal was weak. It always was out here in the valley. The search wheel spun and spun before finally timing out. He cursed under his breath. There were photographs, too. Dozens of them. Black and white shots of trucks backed up to the ravine, men in coveralls rolling barrels off the tailgates. More photos of the barrels themselves, many bearing symbols that Elias recognized from his years working in auto repair. Skull and crossbones. Corrosive materials, warnings, biohazard markers. And in one photo, grainy and slightly out of focus, was a younger Harlan Vance, maybe 30 years old, standing next to a man in a suit. Both were smiling. Behind them, you could just make out the edge of a barrel with a hazard symbol. The date stamp on the photo read, Sept. 1984. Elias's grandfather hadn't just known about the dumping. He'd documented it. He'd built a case. And then, he died. Rusty suddenly lifted his head and growled, a low, rumbling sound that Elias had only heard a handful of times in the dog's life, always when something was genuinely wrong. The hackles on the dog's neck stood straight up. "What is it, boy?" The dog walked to the kitchen window and stood rigid, staring out into the failing light. Elias joined him and peered through the glass. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement in the tree line, maybe 200 yards out. A figure in dark clothing, watching the house. Elias's stomach dropped. He grabbed his phone and tried to call the sheriff's office, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal had dropped completely. He tried again. Nothing. When he looked back out the window, the figure was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a hunter who'd wandered onto his property. Maybe it was his imagination, paranoia fueled by what he'd just found. But when Elias walked out to his truck an hour later to drive into town, he found all 4 tires slashed. And nailed to his barn door with a rusty spike was a dead fox, its neck broken, tongue lolling from its mouth. The message was clear. Someone knows you found something. Someone is watching. Sarah Miller had returned to Blackwood County 6 months ago, and she was already counting the days until she could leave again. The town was dying, had been dying for years, hollowed out by factory closures and an opioid crisis that no one wanted to talk about. The smart kids left for college and never came back. The ones who stayed either worked at the Dollar General or collected disability checks. Sarah had gotten out. She'd made it all the way to Richmond, had a decent job as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in environmental law. She had an apartment with actual insulation and neighbors who weren't her cousins. She'd built a life, and then her mother had gotten sick. Stage 4 breast cancer. The doctors said it was aggressive, unusual for someone with no family history. They also said it was too expensive to treat without insurance, and her mother's policy had lapsed when she'd been laid off from the textile mill 3 years earlier. So Sarah came home. She took a part-time job at the county clerk's office, filed paperwork for property transfers and marriage licenses, and spent her evenings watching her mother waste away in a house that smelled like bleach and defeat. She was at her desk, staring at a stack of deed transfers, when Elias Thorne walked in. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in Blackwood County knew the Thornes. Old family, respected once, but fallen on hard times. Elias looked like he'd aged a decade since she'd seen him last, which had been at least 5 years, maybe more. His face was haggard, his clothes rumpled, and there was something in his eyes that made Sarah sit up straighter. He looked scared. "Can I help you?" she asked. Elias glanced around the office. It was empty except for them, and then approached her desk. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and laid it in front of her. "I need you to look at something," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "And I need you to not tell anyone I was here." Sarah unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of a hand-drawn survey map, showing property boundaries for something called Lot 47B, Thorne Homestead. "Okay," she said slowly. "What am I looking at?" "My property line. At least what it's supposed to be according to this map I found. Can you pull the current deed?" Sarah hesitated. There was something about his tone that made her nervous, but she was also curious. She'd spent months in this office, drowning in tedium. This was the first interesting thing that had happened since she'd started. She pulled up the county GIS system and entered the Thorne property address. The current boundaries appeared on her screen. She compared them to the hand-drawn map, and that's when she saw it. "This doesn't match," she said. "I know. Your current deed shows your property ending at the ridgeline. But this map," she tapped the paper, "this map shows it extending another 40 acres north, all the way to the old Mercer Ravine. Who owns that land now?" Sarah clicked through the records. "It's listed as part of the Vance estate. Has been since 1985. Elias's jaw tightened. 1985. Yeah. Transferred from… Wait. Sarah frowned at her screen. That's weird. It was transferred from the county. Declared abandoned property after a tax lien wasn't paid. By who? By… Sarah looked up at him. By your grandfather, Thomas Thorne. He apparently failed to pay property taxes for 3 consecutive years, and the county seized it. Then Mayor Vance purchased it at auction for," she scrolled down, $2,000. Elias laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "My grandfather was a lot of things, but he never missed a tax payment in his life. He was obsessive about it." Sarah studied his face. "Mr. Thorne, why are you really here?" Elias leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because I think my grandfather was murdered, and I think Harlan Vance did it to cover up the fact that he's been poisoning this county for 40 years. They met at Sarah's house after dark. It was a small, sagging bungalow on the edge of town, with peeling yellow paint and a chain-link fence that listed badly to one side. Sarah's mother was asleep upstairs, doped up on the pain medications that were the only thing keeping her comfortable anymore. Elias had brought everything: the ammunition box, the ledger, the maps, the photographs. He spread them across Sarah's kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. Sarah went through each item methodically, her paralegal training kicking in. She made notes on a legal pad, cross-referencing dates and names. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, but her voice stayed steady. "This is bad," she said finally. "This is really, really bad. Tell me something I don't know." "No, you don't understand." Sarah looked up at him, her face pale. "I've been looking at cancer clusters for months now. My mom's oncologist mentioned that Blackwood County has one of the highest rates of breast and thyroid cancer in the state. They've been trying to figure out why, running studies on everything from air quality to radon levels. But no one's looked at the water. I think whatever's in those drums has been leaching into the groundwater for 40 years. The Mercer Ravine feeds directly into the aquifer that supplies half the county, including my street." Elias felt sick. How many people? Thousands. And if this ledger is accurate, if there really are that many drums of industrial waste just sitting there. Sarah's voice cracked. "My mom is dying because Harlan Vance wanted to save money on proper disposal." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing down on them. "What do we do?" Elias asked. "We go to the police. Vance owns the sheriff. Half the county council is on his payroll. Then we go to the state. Environmental Protection Agency. FBI if we have to. With what proof? These documents are 40 years old. There's no chain of custody. Any lawyer would tear them apart." Sarah thought for a moment, then stood abruptly. "The well. The one shown on your grandfather's map. If the drums are still there, if we can get samples, photographs, that's physical evidence. That's something they can't dismiss." Elias shook his head. "That land belongs to Vance now. We'd be trespassing. Do you have a better idea?" He didn't. "There's one more thing," Sarah said. She picked up one of the sealed envelopes from the evidence pile, one they hadn't opened yet. This was at the bottom of the box. Inside was a cassette tape, the kind that hadn't been common since the 90s. Written on the label in faded ink was a single word: Thomas. Sarah looked around her kitchen. "Do you know anyone who still has a tape player?" They found one at the county library, in the archive room where they kept oral history recordings from old-timers who'd passed away. The librarian, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Kowalski, didn't ask questions when Sarah said they were researching family history. She just showed them how to work the ancient machine and left them alone. Elias's hands shook as he inserted the tape. There was a moment of static, and then his grandfather's voice filled the small room. "If you're hearing this, I'm already dead. And if you're hearing this, you're probably Thomas Jr., or maybe Elias, if enough time has passed. Either way, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell you. And I'm sorry for the burden I'm putting on you by making you know it." The voice was strained, frightened in a way that Elias had never heard from his grandfather. Thomas Thorne had been a strong man, a proud man, not someone who scared easily. My name is Thomas Thorne, and I'm a deputy with the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department, or I was, until tonight. Tonight I'm a dead man walking, and I know it. A pause. The sound of something being moved, perhaps a chair. 6 months ago, Harlan Vance approached me with a business proposition. He said he had some materials that needed discreet disposal, and he knew I owned land with a deep ravine that would be perfect for it. He offered me $15,000, more money than I'd ever seen in my life, said it was all perfectly legal, just cutting through red tape. I was an idiot. I said yes. The first shipment came in January. 40 drums of what they claimed was industrial cleaning solvent. But the smell, God, the smell, and the hazard symbols. I knew right away something was wrong. But by then, I'd already accepted the money, and Vance made it clear that if I talked, I'd be admitting to illegal dumping myself. I'd lose my badge, my pension, everything. Another pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I started documenting everything. Every shipment, every payment, every truck that came through. I copied the manifests. I took photographs. I made maps. I thought if I had enough evidence, I could go to the state police, maybe cut some kind of deal. But then I found out what was really in those drums. I broke one open. Medical waste, radioactive materials, things that should have been disposed of at specialized facilities, not dumped in a hole in the ground. Vance has been taking disposal contracts from hospitals and research facilities all over the region, charging them premium prices for proper disposal, and then just dumping everything in my ravine. I confronted him today, told him I was going to the authorities. He laughed at me, said I had no proof that would hold up in court, that my own involvement made me an unreliable witness, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Tom, you have a grandson, don't you? Little Elias, sweet kid. Be a shame if something happened to him." Elias felt tears burning in his eyes. He'd been 7 years old in 1984. "So, I'm burying this box. I'm hiding the evidence where no one will find it unless they know to look, and I'm going to keep my mouth shut because I can't risk Vance hurting my family. But I'm also making this tape because I don't think he's going to let me live. I know too much. And Harlan Vance doesn't leave loose ends. If you're hearing this, then I was right. I'm dead, and Vance probably made it look like an accident. Please, whoever you are, don't let him get away with it. Don't let him keep poisoning this county. The evidence is all here. The maps, the ledger, the photographs. Everything you need. And Elias, if you're the one listening, I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. I'm sorry I chose my fear over doing what was right. But maybe you can finish what I started. Maybe you can be the man I wasn't brave enough to be." The tape clicked off. Sarah was crying. Elias wasn't. He'd gone numb, his emotions locked away in some deep place where he couldn't reach them. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. "Maybe you can be the man I wasn't brave enough to be." "We need to go to that ravine," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "Tonight, before Vance realizes what you found." Elias nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll drive. My car is less recognizable than your truck." She paused. "And Elias, your grandfather was brave. He protected you. That took more courage than anything else he could have done." Elias wanted to believe that, but all he could think about was 40 years of lies, 40 years of his family suffering under a cloud of shame and debt, all because Harlan Vance had decided that profit mattered more than human life. That was about to end. The Mercer Ravine was on the far northern edge of what had once been Thorne property, now part of Vance's sprawling estate. The area was fenced off with no trespassing signs posted every 50 yards, but the fence itself was old and poorly maintained. They found a section where the chain link had rusted through and pulled it back far enough to squeeze through. It was just past midnight, and a thick fog had settled into the valley, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. Sarah carried a powerful LED flashlight she'd borrowed from her mother's emergency kit. Elias had his grandfather's survey map and a digital camera he'd bought at Walmart on the way. Rusty stayed close to Elias's heels, his nose working constantly. The dog seemed nervous, whining softly every few minutes. The ravine wasn't hard to find. It was a deep gouge in the earth, maybe 40 feet deep and 100 feet across, formed by centuries of water erosion. At the bottom, barely visible through the fog, Elias could make out shapes. Large, cylindrical shapes. Drums. "Jesus," Sarah whispered. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. 55-gallon drums in various states of decay, some still intact, others ruptured and leaking God knew what into the soil. Many were marked with hazard symbols that glowed faintly in the beam of Sarah's flashlight. "We need to get down there," Elias said. "Get photos, samples if we can." "That's insane. We don't have any protective equipment. If there's radiation, we won't stay long, 5 minutes. Just enough to document it." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. They'd come too far to turn back now. The climb down was treacherous. The walls of the ravine were steep and slick with moisture. Elias slipped twice, catching himself on exposed roots. Rusty refused to follow, staying at the top and whining plaintively. At the bottom, the smell hit them immediately, a chemical reek that burned the nostrils and made Elias's eyes water. Sarah pulled her jacket over her nose and mouth. Elias started taking photographs. He documented everything: the drums, the hazard symbols, the corrosion, the stains on the ground where contents had leaked. Sarah used a stick to scrape sample of the discolored soil into plastic bags she'd brought. "This is enough," she said after a few minutes. "We need to go." Elias was about to agree when his flashlight beam caught something else. Something that wasn't a drum. It was a concrete cylinder protruding from the ground. The top of the old well that the county had supposedly sealed in the 70s. Except it wasn't sealed. The concrete cap had been removed and set aside. Elias approached cautiously and shone his light down into the darkness. The beam didn't reach the bottom. The well was deep, maybe 80 feet. But about halfway down, caught on some kind of ledge or outcropping, Elias could see something pale and angular. It took his brain a moment to process what he was seeing. When he did, his stomach lurched. Bones. Human bones. A skeleton, still partially clothed in what might have been a sheriff's uniform, the fabric rotted to rags. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I found my grandfather." They climbed out of the ravine faster than they'd gone down, both of them shaking and gasping by the time they reached the top. Rusty greeted them with frantic licks, his tail wagging with relief. Elias pulled out his phone. Still no signal. Sarah's was the same. "We need to get to town," she said. "To the state police barracks in Ashland. It's about 40 miles. But if we leave now..." The sound of engines cut her off. Multiple vehicles approaching fast through the fog. "Run," Elias said. They ran. Behind them, spotlights suddenly blazed through the darkness, powerful beams cutting through the fog like searchlights. Elias heard men shouting, heard the sound of doors slamming and boots hitting the ground. "There! I see them!" Elias grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the tree line. If they could make it to the forest, they might be able to lose their pursuers in the darkness. But the fog that had been their ally moments ago was now a liability. They couldn't see where they were going, kept stumbling over roots and rocks. Rusty stayed with them, his old legs pumping hard, occasionally barking at shadows. A shot rang out. The bullet whined past Elias's ear and smacked into a tree trunk inches from his head. "They're shooting at us," Sarah gasped. "Keep moving." More shots, but wild, blind firing into the fog. The men behind them were as disoriented as they were. Elias's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. He was 52 years old, not some action hero. But terror pushed him forward, the knowledge that if they were caught, they would end up in that well with his grandfather's bones. They broke through into a small clearing. Elias could see Sarah's car, maybe 200 yards away across an open field. So close. If they could just... Spotlights flooded the clearing, pinning them like insects. 3 vehicles, trucks with lifted suspensions and light bars, had cut them off, forming a semicircle between them and escape. Men got out. 5 of them. Elias recognized 2 as county deputies, still in uniform. The others wore civilian clothes but moved with the confidence of people who'd done this kind of thing before. And stepping out of the lead truck, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who knew he'd already won, was Mayor Harlan Vance. He looked older than in the photographs, his face creased with age, his hair white. But his eyes were the same. Cold, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy. "Elias Thorne," Vance said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I was hoping we could avoid this unpleasantness." Elias stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her with his body. "It's over, Vance. We found everything. The documents, the tape, the bodies. The state police are probably already on their way." Vance smiled. "Are they? Because it seems to me that your truck has been broken down at your house all evening. And Ms. Miller here," he gestured to Sarah, "has been at home caring for her sick mother. No one knows you're here. And in about 20 minutes, there's going to be a terrible accident. A gas leak, perhaps, in Ms. Miller's home. Such a tragedy. Her and her mother, both gone." "You're insane," Sarah said. I'm practical. I've spent 40 years building something in this county. I've created jobs, brought in business, made Blackwood County a place where people want to live, and I'm not going to let some self-righteous nobody destroy that over ancient history. You've been poisoning people, Elias said. How many have died because of you? How many kids have been born with defects? How many people like Sarah's mother are dying right now because of what you dumped in that ravine? For the first time, something flickered across Vance's face. Not guilt, more like irritation. Acceptable losses, he said. The contracts I took paid for the new high school. They funded the rec center. They kept this county alive when everywhere else around us was dying. What's a few cases of cancer compared to that? My grandfather didn't think so. Your grandfather was a fool. He had a chance to be part of something bigger than himself, and he threw it away for what? Principles? Morality? Vance's voice hardened. Your grandfather is rotting at the bottom of that well because he couldn't see the bigger picture. And now you're going to join him. He nodded to his men. Shoot them. Make it quick. The deputies raised their weapons. Sarah screamed. And Rusty, sweet old Rusty, who hadn't moved faster than a trot in years, suddenly launched himself forward with a speed that shocked everyone. The dog hit Vance squarely in the chest, 70 pounds of furious hound, knocking the old man backward onto the ground. In the confusion, Elias grabbed Sarah and ran. More gunshots, but desperate now, panicked. They made it to the tree line as one of the deputies tried to drag Rusty off Vance. The dog's teeth were buried in the mayor's arm, and he wasn't letting go. Rusty! Elias called, but he kept running. He couldn't stop. The dog had bought them seconds. Precious seconds. And he had to use them. Behind them, a sharp yelp, then silence. Elias's vision blurred with tears, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. They crashed through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Elias could hear the men behind them, crashing through the undergrowth, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. And then, suddenly, they burst out onto a road. Not the dirt track that led to Vance's property, but a real road, paved, with a yellow line down the middle. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching fast. Sarah stepped into the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. The car, a state police cruiser, slammed on its brakes, stopping just feet from her. Two troopers jumped out, hands on their weapons. What the hell is going on? We need help, Sarah gasped. There are men with guns. They tried to kill us. There are bodies in a well. Illegal dumping, please. The senior trooper's expression shifted from annoyance to alertness. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible shots fired, multiple suspects. And get me a detective. We may have a homicide. More lights appeared. The trucks, crashing out of the forest behind them. Those men, Elias pointed. They work for Mayor Vance. They tried to murder us. The troopers drew their weapons as the truck skidded to a stop. The deputies and Vance's men tumbled out, weapons in hand, and then froze when they saw the state police. Drop your weapons! State police! For a moment, nobody moved. Elias could see Vance in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his arm bleeding, his face twisted with rage. Then, slowly, one by one, the men lowered their guns and raised their hands. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger, the photographs, the tape recording, all of it was admitted. Forensic teams spent 3 weeks excavating the ravine, cataloging over 200 drums of hazardous waste, many of which had ruptured and contaminated the groundwater supply for half of Blackwood County. They also recovered the remains from the well. DNA analysis confirmed that the skeleton belonged to Thomas Thorne. Ballistic evidence matched the fatal bullet to a weapon registered to Vance's father, a gun that had been passed down to Harlan when his father died. The cancer cluster that Sarah had mentioned became a major part of the case. Epidemiologists testified that the contamination from the dump site directly correlated with the elevated cancer rates in the affected areas. Conservative estimates put the number of related deaths at over 400 in the 40 years since the dumping began. Vance's lawyers tried everything. They challenged the validity of 40-year-old evidence. They argued that Vance couldn't be held responsible for his father's actions. They claimed the shooting in the forest was self-defense. None of it worked. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Murder, conspiracy, reckless endangerment, illegal dumping, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. Harlan Vance was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 73 years old. The judge made it clear that he would die behind bars. The two deputies who'd been at the scene received lesser sentences after testifying against Vance. The other men, hired thugs with long criminal records, got 20 years each. The civil suits came next. A class action lawsuit on behalf of everyone who'd been affected by the contamination resulted in a settlement that bankrupted the Vance estate completely. Every property, every business, every asset was seized and sold. The money went to the victims' families, to fund medical treatments, to pay for the cleanup of the contaminated land. Sarah's mother received a settlement that covered all of her medical expenses. The treatment came too late to save her. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 months after the trial ended. But at least she died comfortable, in her own home, surrounded by family. The county itself was in shock. Harlan Vance had been beloved, respected, a pillar of the community. Learning that he'd been responsible for decades of suffering was almost more than people could bear. But slowly, painfully, the community began to heal. 6 months later, Elias stood in the living room of the Thorne farmhouse, looking down at the newly repaired floorboards. The wood was fresh and clean, the nails bright and straight. You couldn't tell that anything had ever been buried there. The house was his now, free and clear. The foreclosure had been voided once the scope of Vance's crimes became clear. It turned out that most of the Thorne family's financial problems over the decades had been engineered by Vance, part of a long campaign to drive them into debt so he could acquire their land cheap. But Elias didn't want the land anymore. Not all of it. The ravine and the well had been capped and sealed by the EPA, declared a Superfund site that would take decades to fully clean up. That 40 acres would never be habitable again. The rest of the property, though, the good land, the house, the barns, Elias was keeping. He'd paid off his debts with part of his settlement. The rest he'd donated to cancer research and to a fund that helped other families affected by the contamination. He was starting over. At 52, he was finally free of the burden that had haunted his family for 2 generations. Sarah came to visit sometimes. She'd moved back to Richmond but stayed in touch. She'd used her settlement to finish her law degree, planning to specialize in environmental cases. She wanted to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, people whose suffering was invisible to those in power. The photograph on the mantel had been replaced. The new frame held a picture of Thomas Thorne in his deputy's uniform, taken years before he'd made his fatal mistake. He looked young, proud, uncorrupted by the events that would eventually cost him his life. Below the photograph, Elias had mounted his grandfather's badge, polished now, the tarnish cleaned away. Badge number 247 gleamed in the afternoon light. Rusty was buried out back, under the old oak tree where he'd liked to sleep on summer afternoons. The dog had died a hero, buying Elias and Sarah the seconds they'd needed to escape. Elias visited the grave every day, leaving a treat and saying a few words. The floorboards creaked as Elias walked across them, not with the groan of decay, but with the honest sound of solid wood bearing weight. The silence that had haunted this house for so long, the weight of buried secrets and unspoken truths, was finally gone. Elias Thorne stood in the home that 4 generations of his family had occupied, and for the first time in his life, it felt like it truly belonged to him. Not because of ownership or deeds or property rights, but because he'd fought for it. Because he'd refused to let injustice stand. Because he'd been, in the end, the man his grandfather had needed him to be. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, warm and clean. The floor no longer held any secrets, and Elias Thorne was finally, truly, home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable story, where destiny and courage meet in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us continue bringing more stories like this. Your support means everything to us.